What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to another video, and today you're watching Josh's Reptiles. So of course, for today's title and thumbnail, I'm going to be giving you 5 tips on the Crested Gecko care. So I'm also going to be giving you guys just a quick overall guide on how to care for your Crested Geckos. So let's get right into it. So Crested Geckos are a very tropical species of Crested Geckos, and they're also a boreal species, which means they like to climb a lot, and they like to, of course, like climb around on branches and things in the enclosure. So I'm going to be starting off first with enclosure. And with enclosure wise, with your Crested Gecko, of course, because they're an arboreal species, they need a pretty decent sized enclosure. So I would really recommend an 18 by 18 by 24 Exoterra tank, or you could also just do a 16 by 16 by 18 or 18 by 18 by 18 Exoterra tank. Of course, the Exoterras are also really good types of tanks, and most reptile owners would keep their geckos or reptiles in their Exoterras, because Exoterra tanks are really useful because they have the 2 front doors where they can open, and then there's also the top vents. Like on the top of the enclosure there is the mesh net. So it really has overall 3 different entries where you can use to access your gecko's enclosure. Now I'm going to be going through with you guys on the enclosure, on how to set up your enclosure. So with Crested Geckos, you'll also need a pretty decent amount of foliage and branches and hides in your enclosure, because they like to hide. And of course, most geckos like to just hide in their enclosure and sleep for most of the time. So really, what you want to do in your enclosure is that you could start off with the first layer, which would be hydropods. Hydropods are a good layer for drainage. Of course, if you're planning on making a bioactive tank, hydropods are good because they help drain the water. And then after you put your first layer of hydropods, you can add the mesh net over that. And then once your mesh net is placed over the hydropods, you can add in some substrate. And of course, there are many different types of substrates you can use for your enclosure when either building a bioactive tank or just making a plain setup. You could either use paper towel, which is pretty simple start. What I use would be either coconut fiber or eco earth mix with some sphagnum moss, which is pretty good because it's just overall a good substrate and it keeps in a lot of the moisture. Next, what you want to do is you can add some plants inside, whether it can be fake plants or live plants. And then the good thing to do is to add in branches, sticks, or coconut hides. It could even be any kind of hides. I have 2 coconut hides in my enclosure, and of course my gecko likes to hide a lot and climb around. This is my male. He's a dark chocolate harlequin. His name's Rambo. And yeah, he likes to hide a lot and sleep during the day. So with the enclosure, it's pretty simple. All you just need is an enclosure that's not too big, not too small. Of course, one important thing to do with your geckos is that never put your geckos in a tank that's really big, because then it could make the gecko hard to find its food. So maybe right now my gecko is about 2 years old and he is in an 18 by 18 by 24 Exoterra tank, which is a good size because he knows pretty much the whole tank by now, and he knows like where I come to feed it. Most of the time I will just bring out my gecko and I will feed it insects or diet, like Rapashi diet and Pangea. Most of the time it's Rapashi though. So that was just one thing to do. Now I'm going to be going through you guys on feeding. So feeding is also pretty important because of course they need to eat. So with my geckos, I would feed my geckos, I'd say 3 times a week. Most of the time it will be diet, because diet is also a pretty important part of its food source, because of course with diet, whether it be Rapashi diet or Habitat or Pangea, these diets have a lot of nutrients and ingredients which your gecko needs. Like I use grub mix, which is consisted of fruits and insects, and of course all different ingredients, and calcium, protein, and a lot more. Of course, Rapashi and Pangea, these are a really good way of your gecko to make your gecko bulk or to make it grow faster. Of course, always make sure to add the right amount of diet to your gecko's food to make sure it's not too liquidy. And with the crested geckos, one thing to do with your geckos is that, depending on the age of your gecko, on the size of its head, you should realistically feed nothing bigger than the distance of his head going that way in width. So just make sure of that, because if your gecko's prey or if the food is too big for your gecko, it will either act really fierce and it won't eat it, or it'll start to like grunt and make sounds, or it just won't eat. Now, what we just telling you guys on with baby crested geckos, babies, you should try feed them every day because they're a lot smaller and they of course need to grow, and it just varies on the size and the age of your gecko. Of course, as your gecko grows older, then your gecko won't have to eat as much. So of course, after the baby, it's juvenile, sub-adult, and then adult, or he just goes to juvenile and then adult. What's he doing? Never mind. But of course, whether you have adults or babies, just always either search online or just look at tutorials or videos on how to feed your geckos. And of course, just one more important thing to do with your geckos is that if you're feeding your geckos or like Rapashi diet or Pangea diet, one thing to do is that if your gecko is eating the diet and then once it's full of the diet and it doesn't want to eat it anymore, you should definitely take the diet out, because it can start to mold, and this is bad because if your gecko tries to continue to eat the food, then it could just get sick, because then of course the mold is bad for your gecko's health. And just also, if you guys have a cleanup crew, which would be of springtails or wood lice or just any more arthropods, then these are also a good way to clean up your mold in the enclosure. And also, if there's any leftover insects that you have in your enclosure, whether that's multiple crickets, remember to do this, because with your crickets, if your gecko has already eaten and it's full, and then if your crickets are left in its enclosure, then the geckos won't eat them anymore, and then of course the crickets can harm your gecko, which isn't good. And of course, even though geckos they're big and they're not that small, they could still get hurt by such small insects. And of course, if there are multiple crickets, then they can do a lot more damage to your gecko. So that was just one thing to remember. Now I'm going to be just telling you guys just a quick way and just important ways on your crested gecko, of course, besides feeding and enclosure wise. Housing is also pretty important, because geckos, they don't need multiple geckos in your enclosure to live with them. Of course, geckos, they rather have their own tank than having to share with another gecko. And of course, never house two males together in one enclosure, because they can fight, and which isn't good. And also, if your geckos are babies, or if your geckos are maybe juveniles and they're still young, you can house maybe 3 in one enclosure. But as they get bigger, they can start to get a lot more aggressive towards each other. And of course, if you have multiple geckos in the tank, they can also mistake your gecko's tail as food. Now I'm going to be just telling you guys something about handling. So of course, if you guys own crested geckos and you guys also want to handle your geckos a lot, a good thing to do is that you should handle your geckos maybe multiple times a week. With me, I would maybe handle my male 3 times a week, sometimes even 2 times a week, and handling is also a good thing to do with your geckos because it will make your gecko more tame. And of course, if you guys bought a new gecko and you barely handle it, your gecko can also end up being a lot more aggressive, and your gecko also won't be liked to be handled. So also just handling is just a pretty good thing. If you guys wanted your geckos to be happy and not aggressive, handling your geckos, you could just be holding them like this. This is just something good to do for your geckos, of course. It makes them more tame. And I'm going to be just telling you guys lighting and heating. So of course with crested geckos, even though they're tropical species of geckos, important thing to do is that you should mist your gecko's enclosure 2 to 3 times a day, because of course with the humidity it's pretty important, because of course when they shed, then the geckos need a lot more humidity in their enclosure so that their shed will be well. And this is overall, it's good because if your enclosure is misted with water, your gecko will drink the water off the tank, or whether it will be foliage or sticks. And moistening is just overall important for your reptile's safety and health. Now I'm going to be just telling you guys things about lighting. So of course with lighting, crested geckos, they don't really require much lighting like other lizards or other kind of reptiles. You could, if you want, some people use the UVB lighting for your geckos. Of course UVB adds a lot of more benefits, or just adds a few more benefits and important things to your gecko's health. It will also just make your gecko look a bit more vibrant in color. And also with heating, you don't really need heat bulbs for your geckos because they don't bask. They just naturally like to either just hang on the glass, or if it's just sleeping or climbing around in your tank. A good thing to do is have a heat mat at the side of your enclosure, because then the heat will go through the enclosure, preventing heat, and it will go up, making heat come to your gecko. And overall heat mats is pretty better because it's not as hot. Of course in most heat bulbs they come in a variety of watts, like if it's 25 watts or 75 watts. So just a heat mat, it's pretty better because it's not as hot, and it's just a lot more safer to have a heat mat than a heat bulb, because believe it or not, a heat bulb can also burn a crested gecko, like its skin, or could just make your gecko unhealthy in some ways. Because even if your heat bulb is on for ages and you don't have any thermostat, in your enclosure, then the heat bulb can also get a lot hotter than as you started it on. Now I'm going to be giving you guys a quick rule on breeding your crested geckos. Of course, many of you guys who own crested geckos and you guys want to plan on breeding them and selling the babies, or if it's just naturally for the love of reptiles and you want to keep your geckos for breeding them and keeping the babies and continuing its generation of more crested geckos and getting nicer morphs and a lot more genders, of course male and female. Just a rule to make is that with crested geckos, I'm going to be giving you a few tips on what you should do before breeding. So number one would be having a pair. So this is my male here, my female is away in its enclosure, and of course what you want to do is you want to have 2 healthy and full grown crested geckos. Crested geckos can even start breeding from a year, but that's bad to do because they won't be heavy in weight. Of course weight is really important for your geckos because it really depends on the weight. Starting from males, they can start to breed from 35 grams and over, and females would be from 38 grams and over. Of course some females can get pretty big. Of course with my male, he isn't such a big crested gecko. This being is because maybe this gecko's parents weren't as big, and of course with some geckos' parents that had genetics made your gecko be really big. Genetics is also a really important part in your gecko's life of breeding it. Of course if you guys had bigger parents and you bred your parents and then they got babies, and then once the babies grew up they were big as your parents, then this is also just ways of getting bigger babies. The second rule being is that with your female, what you want to do is that you need your female to have a lot of nutrients and calcium. Calcium is really important in a gecko's life of breeding because mainly for the female, when your gecko lays eggs, it needs a lot of calcium in its diet, whether it's being consisted of crickets, insects, or diet. Calcium plays a really big play in part-time of breeding for your females because with females they have calcium sacs which are in the gecko's mouth. At the back of their mouth they have these two wide calcium sacs, and these are important because if your geckos have no calcium sacs, of course if it's being a female, then you're planning on breeding your gecko, then most likely the egg will be infertile because your gecko doesn't have enough calcium in its body or overall in general. Then 2 being enclosure wise, your enclosure should be pretty big for breeding your geckos because of course if your female doesn't feel like breeding and then the male still tries to keep breeding with your female, then what you want to do is you want to have a lot of foliage and hiding spaces in your tank, because then if your geckos don't feel like breeding or if the female feels aggressive towards the male, then your male will be able to have an escape. Or of course if your geckos don't feel like breeding, then your geckos should be able to get away from each other and then you can separate your geckos after that. So it's just overall better to have a bigger enclosure for your geckos while breeding. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I really enjoyed sharing you guys just a quick care guide on my Crested gecko. This is I think a part 2 and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please make sure to comment down below on what you want to see next. Subscribe, share the channel. Of course, those who are new here, welcome. I hope you guys like my content and I hope you guys enjoy watching my videos. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.